The pitch and roll gradients in RST under the suspension tab are a great tool for understanding how stiff the car is both laterally and longitudinally. Before we get into the use cases, let's talk about the required car parameters for these graphs, which are the track width, the wheelbase of the car, and then sometimes for some sims we need the installation ratio, so the IR. But with those car parameters, you'll be able to generate these graphs. So before we talk about the use cases, let's talk about how these graphs are constructed and how they look in RST. So again, these graphs can be found under suspension and then under suspension pitch and roll gradients. And you can see there's quite a few different graphs here. So on the left-hand side, these are all roll gradients, and we have the front roll gradient, which is on top, the rear roll gradient, which is on the bottom, and then on the right-hand side, we have the pitch gradient, which is going to be our longitudinal stiffness. So what is a roll gradient or a pitch gradient? Well, a lot of times we're interested in the roll response of the car, but the car's going to roll at different roll angles depending on the lateral acceleration, right? If we're pulling 2 Gs through a corner, the car's going to roll a lot more than if we're pulling just 1 G, right? So it's kind of hard to understand the relationship of, what is the roll response of a car. So what we do is we normalize it by lateral acceleration. So you can see here for each of these graphs, the y-axis is the roll angle for that axle, and then the x-axis is going to be our lateral acceleration or our longitudinal acceleration for the pitch gradient. And what this is kind of telling us is you can see there's quite a few different dots here on the graphs, but there is a trend, right? There's a linear trend here. And that linear trend is what we refer to as the roll gradient. So you can see here on the right-hand side where we have our the roll gradients, the actual slope of the line there. You can see the front roll gradient, which is this top left graph, is 0.315. So what does that mean? It means for every G of acceleration, the car is going to roll 0.315 degrees. So if I come down here to 1 G, you can see the line is going to be right here, right around this mark, which is right around 0.315. And then same thing at 2 Gs, but this time it would be, 0.315 times 2, which is 0.63. So it's a really good way to understand the roll response of the car. Same thing with the pitch gradient. You can see there's a linear trend here, and then it kind of flattens out in the negative longitudinal acceleration area. And this is because this setup in ACC had very aggressive bump stops. We had very stiff bump stop. So the bump stop rate was very high, and the gap was very low, which means we activate those bump stops very quickly. And one of the points of bump stops in ACC is to prevent pitching under braking for high-speed aero stability. So you can actually observe this in the data. It actually flattens out the pitch gradient. One thing to kind of take note of when you're looking at these roll gradients and pitch gradient is when you're looking at this number, the stiffer the car is, the shallower the slope will be. So if you had an infinitely stiff car, you would have a very low roll gradient. So it would be a very flat line. And inversely, a very soft setup is going to have a very steep line or a very high number. So anytime you're looking at these roll gradients, when someone tells you a roll gradient, if it's a really low roll gradient, you can already just in the back of your mind associate that with something that's very stiff and very responsive versus a high roll gradient, which is going to be very soft and maybe a little bit unresponsive to driver input. So one thing to kind of note is we're not only interested in the front roll gradient or the rear roll gradient, we're also interested in the ratio between these two. So one of the things to kind of note is a stiffer the axle, the more it resists roll, which means it's going to promote more load transfer on that axle. So if we look at these two roll gradients here for this setup, you can see the front roll gradient is 0.315. The rear roll gradient is 0.323. So this front roll gradient is a little bit lower of a number, a little lower roll gradient, which means it's a stiffer axle, which means it's going to have slightly more lateral load transfer on the front than it is on the rear, which is pretty typical for a setup. Usually we want a little bit of a stability margin, so that front is going to be slightly stiffer than the rear in most cases. In RST, we actually take that ratio for you and divide it over here. So you can see for this use case, it was 50.6. So before we talk about the use cases, I want to point out something that's very important. So this distribution, or this lateral stiffness distribution, it's going to change as the setup, as the stint evolves, right? As we burn fuel out, as the tires wear down, or even as the tires are coming up to temperature and pressure, this roll gradient is going to change. And we actually we'll have a future video for the manual in the run. We actually have a roll gradient evolution where you can see how the roll gradient is changing over a stint. But one thing I would just want to point out, so that you guys don't get caught in this trap, lap 4 was one of the first few stints where the tires were still coming up to temperature and pressure. If we actually look at laps 16 and 17, we can actually see there's a quite drastic change in the stiffness distribution. You can't really see it here, but there is a change in the roll gradients. And if we look at that lap 4, our stiffness distribution was 50.6. But after that, like lap 16 and 17, when the tires are up to pressure, they're up to temperature, the roll gradient was 49.8 for those 2 laps. So there was a really big change in that lateral stiffness distribution. And the reason why is as these first few laps, the tires are still coming up to pressure, that actually affects the response of the car. So we all know it from when you're on track, the tires are under pressure in ACC. It feels really bad for lack of better words, right? And that's actually something that you can observe in the data is, that stiffness distribution or the lateral load distribution is slightly changing until those tires are coming up to their ideal pressures. And it mostly has to do with tire spring rates and tire dampening. But just know, if you're going to look at the lateral stiffness distribution, try to go for somewhere after the first few laps where your tire pressures and temperatures are coming up. Usually you'll have a pretty good representation after lap like 5 or 6. But just be aware of that if you look at the first few laps. So let's talk about use cases for where you would want to use pitch and roll gradient. So again, I said pitch and roll gradients are a really good way to understand how the lateral load distribution is through the car, or that roll stiffness distribution. So one thing that I like to use this for is when I'm making setup changes. So a lot of times I like to think of lateral longitudinal and lateral stiffness as kind of 2 different components of the car. And a lot of times I might want to change the stiffness in one of those without affecting the other. For example, Kyalami, that uphill right-hander that as after the crest, a lot of the times I like the mid-corner behavior, but as soon as I get on throttle, I start to understeer really bad. And I don't really want to affect the mid-corner behavior. So a lot of times what I do is I will increase the spring stiffness on the rear. So as I move that load backwards, we're going to start loading up that rear tire quicker, which gives us a little bit more rotation. But when I do that, I also affect my lateral stiffness, right? So what I can do is I can reduce the rear ARB, and that's going to basically reduce some of the lateral stiffness to bring it back in line. So that's a really good example of where I will use pitch gradient. Basically is I'll do some setups. I'll note what my roll gradient is, and then I'll make that spring adjustment. I'll go back on track, and typically my rear roll gradient will be lower now because I added some stiffness, right? So my rear roll gradient will be lower. So then what I'll do is I'll reduce the rear ARB until the roll gradient comes back to where it was before I made that spring adjustment. And that's how I can use roll gradients. Basically to increase the longitudinal stiffness and then keeping the lateral stiffness where it's at. So that's an area where roll gradients are very strong, because without that, we would kind of be guessing of how much we need to change the ARBs to keep that mid-corner behavior the same if we made a spring adjustment for longitudinal stiffness. Another good way is a lot of times the roll gradient is a good representation of the car's response, right? Like I said, a lower roll gradient means the car is more responsive, which means a little bit of steering input might make the car immediately steer, versus a very high roll gradient, which might mean there might be a few milliseconds of delay between the car's response and steering input. So a lot of times if a driver is on a track and says this car feels amazing, it really jives with my driving style, what I like to do is I like to notate what is the front roll gradient and the rear roll gradient, right? A lot of times we might make setup adjustments, and this is a good kind of note to take down to understand, where is the target in terms of the response of the car. So roll gradients are a really good way to kind of just quantify what the driver's preference is. But that's the different use cases. There's a lot of different ways you can use pitch and roll gradients, but they're just a really good tool to understanding, again, the stiffness of the car and how that's distributed between the front and rear axle, and then also the pitch gradient for aero stability. If you have any questions, please let us know on the Discord or in the comments down below, and we'll get to them. But I'm Zach from RST, and I'll catch you guys later.